Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Squared Up Coffee Break webinar series. This week's episode is on open access under the hood. My name is Matthew Long, and I'm joined by product architect Richard Benwell.
Hi, Matthew.
Today we're going to be taking a look at open access and all the sort of depth and glory. And I promised last week that we'd go into this in eye-watering detail. So hopefully, Rich, you've got some eye-watering content for us today.
I'm going to do my best.
Okay, so let's get straight into it.
All right. So I'll be driving this webinar, so I'll go through some slides and some demos. What we'll be covering is open access. We're going to look at what is open access and look at it from a feature point of view and a user experience point of view. Then we're going to take a look at the architecture. So essentially, how does it work? I've got a couple of slides where we'll cover off that. And then we'll go into demo again and have a look at really how it's working under the hood and sort of behind the scenes. And then I'll finish off with just some tips and tricks around scalability and a few gotchas. As Matthew said, I'll be trying to do all of that in eye-watering detail. So hopefully at least a few of you will be crying by the end of this.
I've got my tissues ready right here.
Okay, let's get going then. So open access from a feature point of view is really a unique dashboard sharing technology that we introduced into version 2 of Squared Up. It does not require a logon. So essentially open access dashboards are a way of sharing dashboards to everyone without them having to log on to Squared Up or log on to SCOM. It scales to hundreds, if not thousands of users, and I'll come on to explain why that is the case. But so any dashboard that you want to push out to users without them having to authenticate or without them having to be SCOM users, or if you need to push out a dashboard to hundreds of thousands of users, open access is your technology. It's also more secure than a traditional dashboard. And again, I'll talk about why in a second, but essentially pushing out a dashboard via open access doesn't give the user access to any of the underlying data, both in the form of being able to actually drill down into that data, but even actually getting their hands on, say, the JSON data that's coming from the server or any of the SDK data. They just get to see the dashboard. And last but not least, it's free. So no user licenses are consumed. So again, in terms of deciding when to use open access, if you're really pushing that dashboard out to typically a non-SCOM audience, if you want to push it out to a large number of users, if you want it to be secure and not have users drill down and look at the underlying data, or if you just don't want to pay for a user license, you can use open access to publish out your dashboards. In terms of use cases, typically we see 3 main use cases. So we covered these really last week in terms of publishing dashboards into other portals. So if you want to embed, for example, a status dashboard or report into SharePoint, typically you go down an open access route. So again, it's free, doesn't need a log on within SharePoint. Another typical use case is wall monitors. This really comes from the point of view of the wall monitor not needing any interactivity with the dashboard, so it doesn't need access to that underlying data and drill down. So you might as well not use a user license and go with the free option. So you could publish a dashboard out to, let's say, 20 monitors around your organization, all for free, all very simply without really any kind of extra load on your SCOM infrastructure. And lastly, you can also use it as reports. So if someone does need access to some data on an ad hoc basis, or maybe on a regular basis, but they're not really a Squared Up user, if they just need that monthly report around application uptimes or performance, then you can send them an open access link. They can check out that data and they are not consuming a user license again, and they don't get engaged with that sort of full Squared Up experience. They just get the report landing in their inbox.
So I have 2 quick questions. The first one is open access is available in our enterprise starter pack and above.
That's correct. Yep. Right. So, okay. It's essentially not in the community edition anymore. Right. So you need the enterprise starter pack. So you get the 10 user licenses. So you get those 10 full interactive logons and then unlimited users with access to open access dashboards. And
the second point there kind of is no logon isn't just no defined logon. It's no Windows logon at all. So if you're using this from a device that doesn't support Windows authentication, it's a tablet or it's some kind of Chromium box for your wall displays, it will still work because it's properly open.
Yeah, good question or good point. And I haven't included that in the benefits. So as well as it being secure and scalable, it actually has very low requirements for the endpoint where you're viewing the dashboard. So no, you don't need a logon, either Windows Auth or Forms Auth, but also, as we'll see in a second, the open access dashboard is actually just a bitmap. It's actually just an image. So there's no JavaScript running to render that dashboard. There's not a large amount of data having to be sort of sent down to render that dashboard. So actually sort of low end, thin clients, for example, that are running a web a wall monitor is ideal to publish out to those clients.
Oh, so it'll work in Netscape 3 is what you're saying.
Yeah, let's try that. So that's the pitch of open access. I think probably most of you on this webinar or watching the webinar will be familiar with it. If not, check it out. We will actually now just switch over to a demo of that, and I want to just explore open access kind of from the outside in. Let's look at the user experience and the admin experience before we then look at under the hood and how it's working behind the scenes. So I've just got my squared up instance here, so we're all sort of familiar with this. I'm just going to switch over to a dashboard that we might want to publish out to a wall monitor or into SharePoint. Let's say it's into SharePoint. So my boss wants to see the uptime of all of our applications over the last month. So I can do that here. So I've got this dashboard already created just using our SLA tile. And the user experience in terms of publishing a dashboard out as open access is just using that share button on the top right. It defaults to choosing open access mode. So we can see non-interactive, so no drill downs, no authentication, no logon, and no user license needed. So open access and embed, click generate, and there's our URL. And then we can preview that. Now, what you'll see is it taking a little while. So this is now our open access dashboard, especially the first time there's a sort of slight delay, and then you get the dashboard rendered. Now, what I wanted just to show is I can take that same URL, and I'm going to go into just an incognito mode here. So essentially, I'm not logged on. This is a separate browser instance. If I go to that same URL, the dashboard appears instantly. Yeah. So even just from a user experience point of view, you can see that there's some caching going on, and that's really what means it can scale to hundreds of users. I can have 100 users now hitting this dashboard. It's going to display instantly and put no more load on our SCOM infrastructure.
Right.
The other interesting thing as the sort of user experience is looking at this dashboard. It looks identical. Let's just switch over to the real version. So there's the real version.
Yep. So it's missing the navbar because you chose the embed option.
The embed option, yeah, and there's the open access version. Now, the other strange thing is that I can't drill down. So whereas on this actual dashboard version, I can drill down, say, into any one of these SLAs, with the open access version, I can't drill down. If I right click, all is revealed. It's actually an image. So I can, with Chrome, for example, save this image. Let me just show you that. I'm just going to save that into my downloads there and open that. So static.png. That's just opened up on my other screen. 1 second. And there you go. So that's the image. That's actually the dashboard that's being served up. So it's not rendering it in my browser. It's just serving up this dashboard and showing that in my browser. So that's kind of one clue that something different is going on. Now, what's kind of really interesting about open access and the fact that kind of the user experience really doesn't really reveal the fact that it is an image, because when I change the size of my browser, the dashboard rescales just like you would do in a real dashboard. So the image is being dynamically scaled. I'm just trying to look for a size. If I just change that as well, I should very kind of quickly get that same dashboard. And again, so from a user point of view, it feels like an interactive dashboard in terms of changing the scale and the size. So that's the end user experience. That's great. What I wanted to also show is just a more detailed dashboard. So let's come into a performance dashboard. So it can be a much more complex dashboard. We can include Visio diagrams, external web content, and so on. I'm just going to do the same thing here. I'll do that normal this time so we get the full bar.
If you are seeing this the first time and you're wondering about those different options there, check out last week's coffee break where we actually go into depth into all of those.
So there you go. Dashboard appears with all that data. Now, as well as it being an image, but it rescales. So if I just do that, it'll rescale to fit the screen. It will also update. So it is an image in the sense that it's a static image that all I can do is sort of save that image off and not do much else with it. But it will update in the background. So we can see it's last refreshed a few seconds ago. In 60 seconds time, that image will be re-rendered and served up. So I get the live data just like a real dashboard, and I can resize just like a real dashboard. So that's the end user experience. If we come back and look at the admin experience, so I have now, when I publish the dashboard as open access, it is important to be reminded that a dashboard is open access, because of course you don't have any authentication against that dashboard anymore. That's one reason why we put this tag up on the title here, is to remind you that anything really you put onto this dashboard is essentially public. It's essentially open access.
So if someone's visiting your organization on your guest Wi-Fi and it's not segregated, they could see this
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah, well, someone who's, you may have forgotten that you had published out this dashboard as open access, and then you go and put some other information on it, or you kind of change the nature of the dashboard. Here's the reminder that actually anyone can access this dashboard. It's also a nice reminder of being able to link back to that dashboard and view it in open access mode at any point. If we want to remove open access publishing from a dashboard or manage it in general, we come over to the settings here, go over to open access. And this is where we list out all of the dashboards that have been published as open access. So there's one place you can go and understand which dashboards are available to users without authentication. And I can also drill down into them here. Let's just close down some tabs here. So Sales App Performance has been published as open access. So essentially that is a public dashboard. I can drill down and just remind myself what that dashboard is. Or I can say, okay, I want to essentially unpublish that as open access. So that gets removed from open access. I can also configure the navigation bar for open access. So you can see here that in open access mode, I have a navigation bar. It's currently empty. If I add in that application uptime dashboard, oops, it should be that one. And let's just refresh the open access dashboard. I now have that dashboard in my nav bar. Not sure about the error there, but essentially you can then modify your navigation bar specifically for users who aren't authenticating to Squared Up. So you can both manage which dashboards are published as open access and manage the nav bar within the settings here.
I was going to say, presumably if you have dashboards where you want to share this dashboard out and there's no nav bar, you can use one of the embed options just to remove it. So users see that page and they don't see anything.
Yeah, and generally I think most customers are publishing in that embed mode. They're publishing out to a wall monitor or into another portal. They just want to send that URL, as a standalone URL. But if you do actually have a user population who want to browse a number of different dashboards or come to your Squared Up instance and browse for a particular open access dashboard, then you want to manage that navigation bar. One last aspect from the admin experience that we'll look at briefly, and then we'll go into sort of understand why this is the case in terms of sort of having installed Squared Up. What you'll experience when you install Squared Up is this Squared Up will say, I need to add the Squared Up app pool account as a user who has access to SCOM. So when you first install Squared Up, it prompts you about open access dashboard. You kind of click next and say, okay, fine. What I want to do is just show from an admin point of view what that's done, and we'll kind of come back and explain why it's done it. So when you install Squared Up, during that setup wizard, it will ask you about making or giving the server access to SCOM. What it will actually do is create this Squared Up open access servers role in SCOM. And it's a read-only operator role. So that's sort of visible when you install Squared Up, and hopefully what I'll do in the next few slides is explain why we had to create that role as a read-only operator, and we'll sort of come back and sort of see how we can manage that in the future. All right, let's come back to the slides. So in terms of how open access is working under the hood, what I'll first do is just recap how regular authentication, regular Squared Up access works. We have our end user, they have the browser. We know we have our Squared Up instance. In this case, I'm specifically highlighting the application pool that Squared Up runs as. And of course, we know at the back end, we've got SCOM, so via the SCOM SDK, we've got the SCOM data warehouse, and we've got other data sources like OMS SQL and Web API endpoints. So with regular authentication, the end user comes along, authenticates with Squared Up. That's either through Windows Auth or Forms Auth. Squared Up then impersonates that end user and talks to SCOM as that end user, and that's where we get all the role-based access control from. When it talks to the data warehouse and the other data sources, it does actually use its own service account. So when talking to the data warehouse, the end user doesn't need access to the data warehouse, just Squared Up does. So we've got a mix of impersonating the end user when we talk to SCOM, and then just using the Squared Up app pool account or service account when we talk to the data warehouse and other data sources.
In the case of those two connections to the data warehouse, we're still checking permissions when we do that, but the connection is done as our account.
So the primary connection is into SCOM as the end user. And of course, normal regular dashboards are all rendered in the user's browser. So all of that data is being pulled from SCOM through Squared Up, ends up in the browser. Some magic JavaScript then renders that as your dashboard and makes it interactive. with open access in the picture, things change. So first of all, we've got a user here who we don't know who they are. We never ask the user what his or her name is, or username and credentials. So entirely anonymous. So this user comes in entirely anonymously. As you saw there, I fired up an incognito mode browser and then just hit a URL. I was never prompted to enter my username. So the request comes into Squared Up as an anonymous request. Now, Squared Up can't now talk to SCOM to service that request as the anonymous user, because SCOM won't trust the anonymous user. So what Squared Up does is, first of all, it fires up a sub process, and I'll talk about this in a second, called SSR. Essentially, let's just think of that as a local browser, so a browser kind of running on the Squared Up server. And that requests the dashboard on behalf of the user. Now, SSR is running as the Squared Up service account. So actually, when we go off to talk to SCOM, we use just the service account.
Okay.
And that's why we needed to add the Squared Up server into that role in SCOM. So the Squared Up server itself needs to be recognized by SCOM as a SCOM user. Otherwise, the service account would ask SCOM for some data, and SCOM would say, "I don't know who you are." So that's why you need the service account added into SCOM as at least a read-only account.
Right. That also means that all dashboards that are coming via any number of open access users are going to come in visible to that one identity. So if you were fiddling with that role inside Operations Manager and you reduce the scope, now open access dashboards can't see those objects anymore.
Yeah. And I guess the other very obvious thing is you obviously can't have a mix of role-based access control and open access. So you can't have an open access dashboard that renders different data depending on who's looking at it, like you do with regular dashboards, because of course we don't know who's looking at it. So all dashboards render the same data, and they'll render whatever data the service account has access to with that role. So that goes off. So the SSR essentially is now the browser requests the page. It does it using the service account. It queries the data, renders it to an image, a PNG, and actually then dumps that image into an image cache on the Squared Up server.
And that'll be why it's so much faster when you view it the second time.
Because it's sitting in the cache.
Right.
So to service this anonymous user, all Squared Up has to do is then grab that image out of the cache and serve it back up to the browser. All the browser has to do is show a PNG. And again, that's why once you've rendered that PNG, it's so scalable, because all of your IIS server is doing from then on is serving up a PNG, and IIS servers can serve up PNGs, all day long to really kind of as many users as you want. That's why it's so scalable. That's also why it's obviously more secure, is that all you're doing is sending this image back to the anonymous user. There
are no sort of hacks or browser workarounds to escape that lockdown.
Yeah, exactly.
Mode.
You can't drop down to the API, the JSON API level, and try and get some data out of Squared Up, because you just won't be authenticated. The only thing you can get out of Squared Up as an anonymous user is either logon page in Forms Auth or one of these images from open access. So that's how it looks with open access in the picture. So that's the architecture diagram. In terms of what SSR is, I guess SSR is really the heart of open access. It stands for server-side renderer, and essentially it's a headless browser. So what I mean by a headless browser is it's just like a regular browser, but there's no UI. That's why it's called headless. So when you're thinking, oh wow, there's now a browser running on my servers, well, there kind of is in a way, but you'll never see it. There's no UI there. It actually uses the Chromium rendering engine under the hood, also used by, as you'll probably know or can guess, Chrome. So essentially it's sharing the same rendering engine as Chrome, which is great for us, because it does mean then that if the dashboard looks good in Chrome, the dashboard is going to look exactly the same in open access. It's using the exact same engine.
And I guess if you're used to using, like in your corporate environment, say IE10 or an older version of Internet Explorer or something, and it looks slightly different in a way than it looks in your normal browser, that explains the difference, right? Because Chrome has some subtly differences to how it renders, like boxes and things like that.
So that SSR process runs using the Squared Up service account, as we've seen. When we look in Task Manager, and I'll show you this in a second, it appears as two processes. You've got SSR3.exe, which is the main SSR process, and then you'll see one or more sub-processes called cef-sharp.browser subprocess.exe. The latter is the actual Chromium rendering engine running. So each one of those subprocess.exe are essentially like a browser tab, kind of running without a UI.
And that's presumably one per dashboard.
Yep. Yep. So this SSR connects back to the local Squared Up website. So it is happening entirely local. Essentially, it's connecting to localhost, renders the dashboard to a PNG and dumps it into the cache. Basically, it's magic. This is where it all happens, and it's this technology that really allows us to serve up open access dashboards. It's pretty clever stuff. That essentially you've got a full browser running there, just in the background, rendering your dashboard to an image. So what I want to do is do another demo. So part 2, let's look under the hood. So what I'm going to do is come back into those dashboards, but I'm going to look at them from a server point of view. What I'm going to first do is close down my open access dashboard. So we'll start from a sort of clean slate. That's my IE there as well. And I've got Squared Up here. So let's just come back to sort of a clean slate. And then what I'm going to do is switch over to the server. So we can see Squared Up running in IIS here. So we've got the Squared Up v3 website, and we've got the Squared Up v3 app pool that you can see is configured to run as network service. I'm just going to recycle that. So again, start from scratch. Now, I don't know about you. I always love to sort of understand what's going on with a sort of an application, like from a process point of view. It's like, okay, I can see that it's a nice IIS web app, or I can see that it's a service. Actually show me what's running on this box. I think it's probably from my days working at Citrix, where we had hundreds of different processes running all over the place. And you're never quite sure how it was all working together, and you really wanted to sort of find out what was happening at a process level. So I always fire up Task Manager and have a dig around and actually see what's going on. I don't want any of this magic. So W3WP, so that's the www worker process. So that essentially is what an app pool runs as. And you can probably just see one started up there, which was going to be the Squared Up app pool. So you've got one per app pool. So it's running as network service. So you'll see a lot of CPU generally on W3WP. That is the main Squared Up process. Processing all of the requests coming in, connecting through to the SCOM SDK, connecting through to the data warehouse, and so on. So you typically see a lot of CPU on the W3WP. There should be no other process of interest right now. So what I'm going to do is come back into Squared Up. I'm just going to come off to the side here. And let's look at that open access dashboard again. So if I come into the SLA dashboard, it's because I restarted the app board, I guess.
Yep, that's kicked everyone out. So this is the interactive view of it first.
Yeah, that's where I've had to log on. Just taking a while because it's starting up for the first time. And there's my open access link. So now if I view that open access dashboard, now you should have seen a change on the left-hand side. We've got SSR3.exe with the Squared Up logo, so that's quite recognizable. So that's now running on the server. And SSR3.exe, which doesn't use much CPU or memory, has actually kicked off this Ceph browser subprocess, which is the actual Chromium instance. So that now has essentially running as an instance of Chrome, connecting back to the Squared Up app pool, rendering the dashboard as normal, and then saving it off as a PNG. We would have seen there briefly. a bit of CPU, as it's essentially running the JavaScript in the browser.
Right, it's dropped memory as well. It had about 30 meg more used.
So we have our dashboard rendered, and again, you can see it as an image. Let's just switch over to the file system on the Squared Up web server. So we can see SSR running and the subprocess running to actually render it. Now, if we come into transient cache open access, this is essentially that cache that I had on the architecture diagram. So this is where the image has ended up. And if I just load that up in Paint, there you go. There's the dashboard. So that should match what I have in my browser. If I resize my browser,
I was about to ask how that works, but I'm guessing.
Boom. So that browser instance is still running. So actually you can do it very quickly. That's why it's so quick. So the browser instance is still sitting there with that dashboard open. I just asked for a new size, and there you go. It's now re-rendered it as a new size. That cache gets cleaned up automatically. So now I'm sitting there looking at the new size dashboard. That old size dashboard will get purged out sort of every minute or so. So you don't need to maintain this cache. And of course, what it also means is that when I come into another browser. So let's just grab that URL. Come into Edge here, hit that same dashboard.
It's immediate because it's in the cache. But also,
well, actually, this is a different size. So probably what we have seen there is it's pretty quick anyway because the renderer was still running. It actually resized that dashboard and served it up pretty quickly. But essentially, as soon as that instance of SSR is running, it can render those dashboards sort of on demand very, very kind of quickly. So that's how that all fits together. Let me just come back into Squared Up, and we had another dashboard that we were looking at with open access. So it's this dashboard. I deleted it out, didn't I? So let's just republish that and view it. And then what we should see is SSR sitting there, and we have now another browser instance. So again, every dashboard essentially has an instance of Chrome sitting there rendering that dashboard. And we should also now see in the, sorry about switching around. We should now see in the cache. We'll now have essentially two different dashboards. One is in two different sizes. So building up the cache of all the dashboards there. So
to sort of summarize, if you have 10 users looking at one dashboard, you've got one sub-process running. If you've got 10 users, 5 looking at one size, 5 looking at the other size, you've still got one process running, but you'll have 2 images. And if you've got 10 users looking at 10 different dashboards, you'll have 10 processes and 10 different image files.
So a process per dashboard that's currently being viewed. The processes will be purged as well. So if someone stops viewing an open access dashboard, that process goes away. So essentially one process running per dashboard being viewed. And then you'll have an image in the cache per size of dashboard being viewed. And then for any users that are looking at the same size of dashboard, then you have no sort of new effect on the server at all. That's why it can scale up to 100 users. There's no new instance of the Chromium running. There's no new images in the cache. It's still also serving up the same image there. So that's where the sort of scalability comes from. So that's how it's looking really sort of under the hood. Hopefully that sort of fits together. I'm actually just going to go back on my slides a second. So hopefully sort of see now we had SSR running there. That's actually SSR plus this sub process. There's the image cache that we looked at, and that just then gets served up very simply. In terms of some gotchas and some tips and tricks. So first of all, scalability. We've kind of covered this really just then. So number of users, scalability is not a problem. So you never really need to think about the number of users who are viewing an open access dashboard, which is great because often when you're, say, embedding it into Sharepoint, you don't know how many users are going to see that, right? Yeah, it's open access. It could be 10. It could be your entire organization just happens to then go to that dashboard when there's some outage, right? They all come to that dashboard to see the status. So you've suddenly got 3,000 users looking at that dashboard. Not a problem. So you can scale to that quite easily. It's the number of dashboards that you have to be careful about, and that is limited by your Squared Up server resources. So go on.
I was going to say, well, I guess because as your point there just raised, I don't need to really say this, but like because your Squared Up server typically your Squared Up server is normally just handling the request and then giving your browser all the work to do. But here it's doing both.
Yes, exactly. So with open access, your Squared Up server is essentially becoming a client, which turns things sort of on its head a little bit. So now actually you have all of the JavaScript, for example, running on the server. Each dashboard requires a browser instance. So think of it as a sort of separate tab viewing each dashboard. And this is why you've got to be careful with complex dashboards. So you can publish anything as open access. You can publish Vader diagrams as open access. You can publish a graph of 1,000 kind of CPU metrics as an open access dashboard. But bear in mind that the larger the dashboard, the more data it can contain and consume memory. And to render that dashboard, especially Vader, we've made some optimizations to make sure Vader renders as efficiently as possible in open access. But there is a fair bit of sort of CPU going on there to run all that JavaScript to draw the topology view.
And I guess go back to last week, if you're embedding other sites into Squared Up using the Web API tile, whatever they're doing is also now being run here. So you could run into a scenario where Squared Up's fine, but actually the other site's really JavaScript heavy and is killing it.
So that's all happening on your server. So we saw there in the task manager, I think each process that's essentially running a browser instance is around 100 meg of memory. That's going to vary depending on the content of the dashboard. So if you're putting a lot of data from SCOM and rendering it in your dashboard, or you have the web content tile with other websites embedded, it's going to be more of that. So about 100 meg per dashboard. Generally, we see, obviously you can get 10 dashboards using, say, sort of a gig of memory, obviously a bit of CPU every time those dashboards are refreshing. It can get to 10 fairly kind of comfortably, depending on the size of your dashboards. If you're going greater than sort of 10 dashboards that you're publishing out, and I should say concurrently, right? So they're being viewed concurrently. So you can have 100 dashboards that are only viewed occasionally, not a problem. But if you have sort of more than 10 dashboards being viewed at any one time, you maybe want to first of all, keep an eye on the process usage on your squared up servers, but then consider actually maybe dedicating a squared up server for open access. So setting up essentially high availability, sort of a farm of squared up servers, sharing the same config, and then dedicating one to serving up open access dashboards. But just be aware that, they're not free, as you say, Matthew. Like all of that processing is now happening on the server, not on the client. So you should be much more aware of the resource usage on your squared up servers when you publish out open access dashboards.
One thing I was going to ask, actually, I'm getting a bit technical, with that overhead. So when you have like interactive users in SCOM, there's the overhead there of an SDK connection for every single user. If you've got 5 different open access dashboards being rendered, is each of those also having its own SDK connection as well, or is SSR managing one SDK connection?
Good question. Yeah, good question. Well, you have 2 benefits, I guess, with open access. First of all, is the actual end users don't need a connection per end user. That's great. Obviously. That's why you get 1,000 users, right? You're not having 1,000 users accessing SCOM. You only have the one user access SCOM, which is the squared up service account. But actually, yeah, you're absolutely right. Although there are, for 5 dashboards, there are 5 separate Chromium instances rendering that dashboard. They're all doing that using the same user account, and hence all sharing the same user's connection to SCOM. So all of your open access dashboards, regardless of how many users and how many dashboards, are only consuming one connection to SCOM, because it's all under the squared up user account.
Right. And I guess going back to sort of the complexity of memory usage and everything else, like wall dashboards, typically you don't want to make them necessarily too complex anyway. Like, you mentioned a performance graph that's showing metrics for 1,000 servers. Yep. That's not going to be a great graph anyway. So sometimes you can look at your dashboards and say, this will probably scale quite well because we're trying to keep it simple so it's clean and easily digested by either the audience because it's on a wall, or an audience because they're not technical. They don't necessarily need a huge amount of detail in all their alerts and everything else.
Yep. Okay, so that was some guidance on scalability, and then what I want to do is just cover off some other gotchas. There are 3 of them that I want to cover. This is on behalf of the support team. So when people are coming in with issues with open access, so the 3 things you might encounter. First of all, custom IS bindings and SSL certificates. Essentially what happens, we talked about SSR connecting locally. So it does that by pointing SSR back at HTTP localhost, right? Okay. Great. So that works in most cases. Now, what happens when you put SSL certs and you can't go to HTTP localhost if you've required HTTPS? So if SSL is enabled, don't worry, SSR detects that and says, okay, I'm going to go to HTTPS, and then localhost is not going to work because your cert is not going to be targeting the localhost address. It assumes the cert is going to be targeting the server name. So if you've installed a cert it's sort of target.
Wildcard?
Wildcards as well. That's fine, right? That will work. But if you have a cert that actually is your fully qualified domain name, it's not going to work because we're going to be hitting just the server name. So that cert does have to be valid for the server name. If it's not, you have to configure custom bindings, and SSR will look in your IIS custom bindings and go, okay, this is the address you've set up. I'm going to hit that address, right? Because that's the one you've defined. So we'll use the first binding it finds and try and connect on that. So if you are going down an SSL route and the SSL cert is not just for the simple server name, then make sure you've configured your binding so SSR knows what address to use. We have got into sort of a kind of quite an awkward situation where if your cert is for your open access if your cert is for your high availability address, so essentially your load balanced address, then suddenly SSR is going back out to the load balancer and getting load balanced off to another server and so on. So just drop support a line if you think you're sort of are not getting open access working as expected, because maybe you've sort of set up some more interesting bindings.
On that front as well, I'm assuming the certificate has to actually be trusted. So if you're usually using a self-signed cert and you're saying to users, just ignore that warning and just browse through anyway. In this case, presumably SSR is going to say, I actually want this trusted.
Yeah, self-signed certs.
Yeah.
Tut. Yeah. No, I think so. Yes, because I think the server itself doesn't even trust a self-signed cert from itself, right?
Yeah.
So you would need to add that in to a trusted certificate store.
Mm-hmm. But of course, no one would ever use self-signed certs. It's fine.
Next, gotcha. Changing the app pool account. So we've just sort of talked about how essentially open access dashboards are rendered on behalf of the end user using the app pool account, the service account.
Mm-hmm.
During setup of Squared Up, we put that service account into that role in SCOM to make sure it has the read-only permissions. If you then go and change the Squared Up app pool account, that app pool account needs SCOM permissions.
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't gone and updated that role, you need to go and do that. So you need to add the new service account into that Squared Up open access servers role in SCOM, and that should all be you need to do. So just remember that if you change the app pool account, you'll break your open access dashboards.
Mm-hmm.
Last one, using the data on demand tile, one of your favorite tiles, Matthew, especially with that PowerShell management pack, isn't it great? So using the data on demand tile, now there's a gotcha here, which is the data on demand tile requires SCOM task permission. So it runs a SCOM agent task and renders the result into the dashboard.
Mm-hmm.
So that's great. Problem with that is that read-only roles, which is what the open access server role is, doesn't have rights to run tasks. They can only see data. They can't ever run tasks, right. And generally don't want your read-only operators being able to run arbitrary tasks. So the solution there, which you have to sort of consider carefully, is changing that Squared Up open access server's role. So by default, it's a read-only role that doesn't have permission to run tasks. If you have dashboards with data on demand tiles and you want to serve those up through open access, then consider changing that role to an operator profile and then giving that operator profile or operator role specific permissions for the tasks you need in your open access dashboards. It does obviously increase the privilege that your open access dashboards are running as. Generally, that should be sort of fine, but obviously a best practice is to always kind of minimize those privileges your service account has. So you can elevate your service account to have this operator profile and have those task permissions, but use with caution.
Yeah, especially if you're not necessarily sure about what the performance impact of that task actually is. Like if this task is mildly performance impacting, but it's going on a dashboard that winds up on a wall somewhere. Because once you give that URL out, once you give that open access URL out to someone,
Mm-hmm.
they can use it for any purpose you
Mm-hmm.
like. So you might not consider it going on a wall, but that user's friend's user might put it on a wall dashboard in their room, and now that task's running 24/7 every minute.
Yeah.
So that could really cause problems if you're not careful. I guess sort of something that's occurred to me as well, looking at this sort of slide has sort of prompted me that if you had some like sensitive objects in SCOM where you're like, this stuff should never appear on a wall dashboard, you could also go and reconfigure that Squared Up open access servers role to say it isn't a read-only role that's globally scoped anymore.
Yep.
It's scoped to only these non-sensitive, objects, so people can show that stuff. But the second it tries to view any of those sensitive objects, they're not in its role. It's not allowed to see it. Boom, they won't show up in open access.
Yep. And in theory, if you had multiple Squared Up servers, you could actually have them running as in different accounts, that have different privileges that can serve up different open access dashboards and so on and so on. So hopefully the point of this webinar is to explain how it's all working under the hood, so that when things either are not working or you need to go into some more advanced scenario, you can kind of sort of piece things together and see how it all should work.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I think that's all I had, Matthew. So I'll hand back to you for a kind of a recap of resources.
All right, thank you very much, Rich. So let us know what you'd like to cover. We love getting feedback here at Squared Up, and we want to make sure that these coffee break webinars are as useful as possible to you guys. So if you go to squaredup.com/topics, you can fill out a survey there. Let us know what you want to hear from us. And we have adjusted the schedule several times based on user feedback. So make sure you go there and let us know what you want to hear about during these sessions. If you go to the microsite at squareup.com/coffeebreak-series, there's a sign-up page there, so you can actually sign up to the webinar. Great for if you've seen this and thought, my colleague would really like this stuff, or there's a new starter, you should really get to grips with this stuff. And also you can see what's coming up next as well, so you can see next week's episode. The recordings and slides for this webinar are published at our blog, along with a wealth of other good stuff. If you haven't been to the blog recently, there's currently a post on there about our upcoming Squared Up 3.3 release webinar.
Yeah, indeed. There's been a lot of chat on the Q&A around upcoming releases, which we're going to cover off in next week's webinar, and also about plans for Ignite. But we have a new release coming up, 3.3. The release webinar is on Monday. If that's not in your calendar already, go to squaredup.com/blog. The top posting there is around the release webinar, so get signed up for that. And then on the coffee break following that, so next Tuesday, we'll probably do a recap on some of the more interesting kind of new sort of features and changes in that release, and also kind of talk about where we're heading with releases for the rest of the year. In regards to Ignite, if you are going to Ignite, do just drop us a line. If your colleague's going to Ignite, do make sure they swing by the booth. We've got lots of goodies to give away again, and we're actually showing off some of the upcoming releases and features we have for the rest of the year at Ignite for the first time. So if you are a customer or have someone who's engaged with Squared Up, send them over to our booth. I think we'll provide details, probably on our blog, but essentially the plan is when the expo opens on the first day, we're actually going to kick off with a preview of some of the upcoming features we have. So kind of make sure you kind of get there or send a colleague there. Yep,
it should be easy to find us with a massive orange sign. It's pretty hard to miss our booth. So check out the blog if you haven't already. And then we also have a YouTube playlist for this series as well, which you can, not great URL, but you can go to YouTube and there's a Coffee Breaks playlist. So you can just sit back and listen to, I think, 24 hours or more of me and Richard talking about Squared Up, which is quite cool. So definitely check that out if this is your first Coffee Break webinar. Now, as always, myself and Richard are going to be online along with our engineering team. So if you have any questions about open access or anything else Squared Up related, feel free to pop this into chat and we'll answer those. If you haven't got any questions, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for joining me, Richard.
Thanks, everyone.
And have a great day.